You're about to hear the first-hand account of Thomas Francis Galwey, a young Irish immigrant who fought with the 8th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, a regiment that earned distinction at Antietam and stood at the very center of the Union line during the decisive clash at Gettysburg. Galwey was just a teenager when he enlisted, but his vivid memory and sharp observations offer one of the most compelling personal narratives of the Civil War. What follows is his own description of those fateful days in July 1863, lightly edited for clarity and flow, but staying true to his original words. Through his eyes, you'll experience the long marches, the exhaustion, the chaos of battle, and the heroism of ordinary men. If you enjoy this kind of first-hand history, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. It helps more history enthusiasts discover these forgotten voices of the past. On Thursday, July 2nd, we were up at 4. The artillery on both sides had already begun to fire. At first light, we found a little stream where we washed and made coffee. We were given only a few minutes for this before we fell in and marched off to the left. As soon as we reached the Baltimore-Gettysburg Turnpike, we took it and continued until we came to the long ridge that stretches for a mile and a half from the cemetery toward Little Round Top. Our brigade, Carroll's, formed up behind Ziegler's Grove, with our right resting on the Baltimore Turnpike. Across that road, to our right, lay the cemetery. It was a beautiful sight. We could see for miles in both directions. In the middle of the valley to our right lay the pleasant town of Gettysburg. Behind it, on the ridge, stood the seminary, flying the Confederates' yellow hospital flag. Still farther to the right on the same ridge was Gettysburg College, which struck us as a rather imposing edifice. But the college and the seminary were now performing duties their founders never imagined. While we waited, some of us wrote letters to loved ones, letters that might be found in our haversacks if we lost our lives in the coming fight. I made pencil sketches and jotted down notes of my thoughts. The clouds had scarcely lifted from the mountains, yet already puffs of smoke rose from the windows of houses in the town, placed advantageously for sharpshooters. Our line was extending rapidly to the left, where most of the attention now seemed focused. In front of us we saw enemy skirmishers descending the slope of Seminary Ridge and advancing into the middle of the valley, where a slight rise of ground offered some cover. Our own skirmishers greeted them with a warm fire, which they returned, and so it continued until noon as the fighting on our left intensified. About a mile and a half to the south, the action was heating up. A peach orchard and a cluster of farmhouses near the Emmitsburg Turnpike were soon shrouded in thick white smoke. From the base of Round Top, our artillery had opened up. By mid-afternoon, it had become a very desperate battle out there. From our position, we could see it all quite plainly. Around 4 in the afternoon, orders came for our regiment to skirmish. The fire had become intense. Our batteries had taken position under a galling fire from the enemy's artillery and from his skirmishers, who were posted in the cornfields in front of us. It was to dislodge these latter for the sake of our guns that we were ordered forward. We moved down the hill in line of battle, colors flying, the artillery and the rest of the brigade cheering us on. At the Emmitsburg Pike, running along the base of the ridge where our artillery stood, we halted. 2 of our companies were deployed in skirmishing order and advanced into the corn. That woke the Johnnies. Now the bullets flew. Our batteries on the hill behind us gave excellent support, exploding their shells just ahead of our skirmishers and among the Confederates. We drove the enemy back from the turnpike, across the fields to a fence in a group of farmhouses, where they turned and checked our further advance. Night came on and ended any more serious fighting. But the crack of rifles, the boom of cannon, the singing of bullets, and the roar of shells overhead, like a train of cars crossing a bridge, continued throughout the night. As we lay on our backs courting sleep, we could at any moment open our eyes and see the skies streaked with the fiery traces of shells flying back and forth, like shooting stars, between the artillery on both sides. Shortly after 8 o'clock, things grew quiet. Then, toward 9, I was on the skirmish line with my company when the artillery opened up vigorously again. It required all our experience in the chaos of battle and all our familiarity with the strange contours of the ground to keep from falling back to the grove from which we had come, where we believed the rest of our brigade remained. The common soldier on the battlefield, doing his duty, knows little of the overall movements of the battle. Of course he's anxious to know, but he only begins to understand after the fighting is over, when he can talk to men or officers of other regiments, or perhaps to captured prisoners. I was fortunate to know a few staff officers who shared what they knew, which helped me sketch how the battlefield looked to me at the time. A soldier advances, retreats, or wheels left or right as his command moves. To him, his regiment, or at most his brigade, is the whole army, and usually, even if he has time to look, he cannot see very far. He might be in a cornfield where the tall stalks wave above him, or behind hedges, trees, barns, even chicken coops, all of which block his view. If he is with his regiment, he has no chance to climb some height from which to view the entire field, and very few men are in a position or have the freedom to do so. We on the skirmish line lay very close to the ground. Though it was dark, we could still make out enemy figures, just as they could see ours. The fighting beyond the cemetery kept us alert, for we knew not when we might have to withstand a charge from heavy enemy lines. The regiment, 9 of its companies, lay in the ditch along the Emmitsburg Turnpike. That ditch, being broad and deep, offered excellent shelter. One company was always kept forward on the skirmish line, about 75 yards ahead, along a fence. The skirmishers before us had pulled down the fence, making a continuous pile of rails that gave fair protection to men firing while lying down. I had been out on the line with my company until about 9 o'clock, when we were relieved by another. But at midnight we were sent back out to that same fatal fence. Again everything became quiet, eerily so, considering the storm we all knew was brewing for the morning. My orders were to keep my men under the strictest vigilance, but that was difficult. We were all exhausted, and I could hardly keep my own eyes open. Word slowly filtered down that our regiment had already lost 44 men killed or wounded before dusk. That grim rumor gave us something to discuss and kept sleep at bay. 2 or 3 times I felt myself dozing off, and each time I would rouse myself and whisper something to one of my men, who always seemed to be nodding as well. At 4 in the morning, Friday, July 3rd, I was relieved and brought my company back to the ditch along the road, where we stretched out and slept, and how we slept. Just before 6, I was shaken awake by the adjutant and ordered to take the company out again. We deployed in the ditch, then ran forward to the fence, relieving Captain Pierce's Company K, which withdrew at a run. The movement drew a brisk fire from the enemy skirmishers in our front, which continued without pause from that moment on. The rails of the fence had been torn from the posts and piled up to create a low barricade, just enough to protect the heads of men lying behind it. When we reached that fence at 6 in the morning, we saw the work death had done since the previous afternoon. Our fallen skirmishers lay so thick along the line that it was hard to find room to stretch ourselves. About 150 yards to our left front stood a large barn, one of the kind common in this rich part of Pennsylvania where barns are finer than houses. Since daylight, sharpshooters had kept up a steady fire from its windows, targeting our artillery on the ridge behind us. At last, the fire became so troublesome that a battalion with its colors moved out from our left and, with a hearty cheer, charged the barn. We had often speculated on how many men it might hold, since it had so often made us the target of its fire, but nothing prepared us for what we saw when the New York regiment, I do not know its number, reached it. At least 200 Confederates came pouring out of the barn and surrounding buildings in confusion. The New Yorkers put the torch to it, and as flames burst through the thrifty farmer's roof, we gave a cheer. Fired by their example, and so far as I know without orders, we charged straight ahead. We drove the enemy back down the opposite face of the low ridge and up the next slope, where we could clearly see the masses of their main line, about 200 yards off. There we were met by repeated blasts of canister from the batteries directly in front of us and by shell fire from their reserve artillery on Seminary Ridge. That checked our advance. As we reformed, their rallied skirmishers turned on us again. We fell back slowly, firing as we went, until we returned to our old position at the fence. All of this took place between 7 and 8 in the morning. The skirmish fire now became murderous. It was a steady kind of fighting, born of familiarity with the ground and the enemy's methods. The fire was fast, but not wild. There was little random shooting. Standing upright was almost certain death. The ground was already littered with our wounded from the early morning advance, and when we retreated to the fence they had to be left where they lay, caught between the 2 lines of fire. Around mid-forenoon, a cry rang out, "Don't fire, Yanks!" We all rose up to see what was coming. A man with his musket slung across his shoulder stepped out from behind a tree. Several of our men raised their rifles, but others stopped them, wanting to see what would happen. The man held a canteen, and when he got about halfway to us, we saw him kneel down and give a drink to one of our wounded lying between the lines. God bless him. We cheered the Reb, and someone shouted, "Bully for you, Johnny." While this played out, all of us had risen to our feet. The enemy had also stopped firing and stood watching. When the sharpshooter finished his act of mercy, he turned, walked back to the tree, and called out, "Down, Yanks, we're going to fire," and down we went again. At 10 minutes to 1, precisely by my watch, after a lull in the cannonade, a heavy gun boomed from the enemy's line. Instinct told us it was a signal. The day before, there had been desperate fighting on our left, which had resulted in nothing but slaughter. Last night, Ewell, using Jackson's old corps, had assaulted our right, also to no effect. Now we all felt they would try one last time, against us in the center. When that heavy gun fired, we could see a general bucking up all along our own line. We had just received fresh ammunition, and our men immediately began arranging their cartridges and caps in anticipation of the trouble to come. A short pause followed the signal gun. Then the air shattered with the most terrific cannonade I had heard since our guns opened at Fredericksburg. From 10 minutes to 1 until 2:30, The Pennsylvania hills shook with that awful sound. We lay on our backs in the ditch, heads toward the enemy. We could see our artillerymen hard at work, jackets off, sleeves rolled up, serving their guns. It was an inspiring sight. The enemy's artillery was soon doing real damage. Now and then a shell would hit one of our battery's ammunition chests, blowing it sky high with a deafening roar. Still, our gunners stuck to their work, shouting wild Indian yells when they saw that a shot had landed well. We were caught between the two lines of fire, though thankfully beneath the main paths of the shells. Both sides seemed content to let the artillery do the talking for now, knowing that the real work of the infantry was close at hand. The roar became so monotonous that it dulled the senses. I drifted off to sleep, so I was told later. Most of my regiment did the same. Several men were hit while we lay there. Charlie Gallagher, who had crossed the road and lain down in the shade of a tree, was severely wounded while sound asleep. I slept about 10 minutes before I woke. Soon after, I was struck in the foot by a spent shell fragment. While I was still laughing about that, I was hit again, this time in the thigh, by another shell fragment, knocking me over. I got up, only to hear the same gloomy fellow I had helped at Antietam say he feared the next hit would be fatal. There's always a prophet of doom on the field. The cannonade had gone on for about 40 minutes when sharp musketry broke out on our skirmish line in front. We jumped to our feet. Then came a distant murmur, followed by renewed artillery fire, which had slacked for a few moments. Suddenly, the murmur rose into a sustained yell, and we saw the enemy, colors flying, advancing in massed columns just to the left of where the barn had burned that morning. I had read of charges, and I'd seen a few myself, but never had I witnessed anything like this. That beautiful gray mass with its compact squares of color came on in perfect order, their peculiar cheer rising as they advanced toward the crest we were to defend. We rushed forward to the fence line. Now, against us directly, came a large force of the enemy formed north of the massed column. Later I learned the column was Pickett's division of Longstreet's corps, and the force moving on us was composed of Pender's and Pettigrew's divisions of A.P. Hill's corps. They came in two lines of battle, their batteries galloping in the intervals. Our artillery now opened with a fury that only the heroic could endure. As their lines drew nearer, we watched, anxiously, that dense, dreadful mass nearing our left. We stood alone in the open, our flags waving. Despite the threat bearing down on us, we couldn't help admiring the Confederate officer who rode ahead, a perfect target for 60 guns and thousands of muskets. A moment later, a cheer rose to our west. Pender's line, flags flying, burst from the trees on the low ridge ahead and charged straight at us. But from the start, it was plain their spirit didn't match that of Pickett's men. 2 or 3 times their line faltered, whether from disorder on the uneven ground or shaken by the shells bursting in front of them. The explosions sometimes obscured them in smoke, but when it cleared, the blasts had torn their ranks apart. They reached the fence where Confederate skirmishers had been since the battle's start and lay down, but not for long. We poured such deadly fire into them that panic soon set in, and they broke, fleeing back over the low ridge. With Pender repulsed, all our fire turned on Pickett. Still they came on, the mounted officer still leading. Shells burst among them, sometimes engulfing them in smoke, but when it cleared, the gray mass was still coming, compact, orderly, and raising those eerie yelps that used to terrify green troops. They had climbed the last slope. Now, between them and the crest of the heights, there was nothing but blue-clad men, some behind a stone wall. They neared the turnpike, just to our south. They paid us little mind, though we were raking their left flank with deadly fire. They crossed the road and began ascending the rise to the stone wall. Our confidence returned. With fresh ammunition, we poured round after round into them. Still they advanced, cheering as they reached the wall. Our men at that point broke and fell back beyond the crest, which there was not as high as where we stood. For a moment, things looked bleak. The enemy had taken Griffin's battery and were beginning to turn the guns on our line. But just in time, Major Rorty of Hancock's staff, rallying part of the 29th New York, charged and retook the battery. The enemy, now disorganized and isolated, began to retreat, and the retreat quickly became a rout. From our position on their flank and from other units on their southern flank, we kept up a withering fire. At last they began to crumble. They had reached the ridge crest, victory almost in hand, only to be broken and driven into a disastrous flight. They threw everything away, cartridge boxes, belts, haversacks. We dashed in among them, taking prisoners by the dozens. One corporal from my company captured 15 men, including 2 officers and a stand of colors. As far as the eye could see, the ground was covered with fleeing Confederates, arms stretched out as if to help their escape. From the enemy's signal gun at 10 minutes to 1 to the collapse of Pickett's charge, just 70 minutes had passed. Our own losses were heavy. I had been hit 3 times between the start of the cannonade and the enemy's rout. The first and second sergeants of my company each lost a leg. Old John Burke, who had served 21 years in the 18th Royal Irish before joining us, also lost use of a leg. Lelièvre, an old French sailor, was crippled. Wilson was killed outright. So was Corporal Barney Maguire, a brave, humorous fellow. Private William Brown died before nightfall. Out of 216 men our regiment brought into battle, 103 were killed or severely wounded. Nearly every other man was hit. We suffered nearly 100% casualties. As Pickett's men fled, our 150 survivors captured about the same number of prisoners. When we reached the ditch along the Emmitsburg Pike on our way back, the sight was dreadful. Wounded men had been carried or had crawled there during the fight, some dying after they arrived. The ditch ran with blood, and the grass in front of it was soaked. Among the many wounded were 2 of our sergeants, Fairchild and Kelly, each with a leg hanging by a strip of flesh. That brought tears to my eyes. Both were brave men and well loved. We were only allowed a few minutes with our wounded before we reformed our shattered line. As we climbed back up the hill we had descended the day before in fine array, the artillery cheered us and called out praise. The battle was virtually over. We crossed the Baltimore Pike and went down into a hollow, where we lay in the grass to rest. Provost guards soon arrived to take custody of our prisoners and the captured colors. Both armies were spent. One was defeated, pausing before retreating. The other was victorious, but compelled, by sheer humanity, to tend the thousands of wounded and bury the countless dead scattered across the field. Every house and barn became a hospital. Men scoured the ground looking for comrades and offering aid, even to the enemy wounded who lay everywhere among our own. Night fell. The only sounds were the groans of the wounded, the prayers of the dying, and the tearing of shelter tents and clothing for makeshift bandages. After doing what I could for my own wounded, I lay down and slept,